So irresistible grace. Now on to the fourth point. The term, unfortunately, suggests a mechanical and coercive force upon an unwilling subject. This is not the case. Instead, it is the act of God making the person willing to receive him. It does not mean that a person cannot resist God's will. It means that when God moves to save/regenerate a person, the sinner cannot thwart God's movement and he will be regenerated. God moves the heart of the person where he wishes it to go. We see that in Proverbs. And the choice and mercy of God depends on God's desire, not man's ability.
Yes,
Blakely agrees. All right, cool.
Well, actually, the way this is defined, I don't have too many problems with. I guess I was expecting a little bit of a stronger definition about no one can resist God's grace. And I think when I think of irresistible grace, I guess I first think in my own life, and I think, when God has moved towards me in different ways, even if there was some resistance or rebelliousness in my heart initially, God always got through to me. And certainly I feel like, although I made a choice to accept his offer of salvation, again, God had to confirm that because it was based on something that had already been done, and in no way could I kind of guarantee myself that I'm going to be righteous or accepted or justified in God's eyes, even by accepting that offer of salvation, because I think we probably all know stories of people who, in an insincere moment or a moment where they didn't even fully understand what they were doing, claimed that they accepted Christ, but we see later there's no fruit of the Spirit in their life, and those people probably aren't saved. And so I think God absolutely has to confirm those choices that we make to accept his gift of salvation, and then subsequently in the life of the believer, I think there's plenty of other instances where God's grace gets through to us. Now, we may be resistant or stubborn, but it always gets through to us. But where I would, I guess, underscore just how I define irresistible grace, I do think there are people walking around who have absolutely turned their backs on God, and it's not because God hasn't tried to reach them with his love, with his grace, but they're hard-hearted, they're stubborn, they are trapped in their sins and trespasses, and they will not listen to God. They're not going to hear God, and that's a great tragedy. And that doesn't mean that can't change at some point later in time, but the evidence, I think, is that there are people that do resist God's grace. But I think particularly in the life of the believer, you see that God's grace always comes through, and it's pretty remarkable, because even as Christians sometimes we can try to ignore God or try to distract ourselves away from God, but he gets through to us. So, but the definition, I didn't really have a problem with the way this was defined.
I have a question real quick.
Yeah, sure.
I usually start this way. Would you agree that the grace of God is what saves people?
Yes. The grace of God, we have a choice, but it's through the grace of God. Okay. Yes. Ephesians 2:8-9, all the way. We're no work on my part. I make a decision, but it's totally through God's grace that is possible.
Through our faith.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay. I just want to clarify your view. In an earlier video, you said that we believe, and therefore God declares us justified. Mm-hmm. From what you just said, and make sure I'm quoting you right, is that God can somehow give us some of his grace and entice us to come to him, and yet some people can deny it or walk away from it. Would you agree with that?
Well, what I would say is that God's grace is out there for everyone. Some people choose to respond to that, and then again, God confirms that, because the work of salvation is totally based on what he's done, not anything that we're going to do. But there are other people who that grace is given to, who reject that or turn their backs on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Thank you for clarifying that. Because I guess based on where that question come from is, I think essentially what your view on unconditional election is will define what your view on irresistible grace is. In the sense of, for example, I believe God chooses people for the foundation of the world. And therefore, when God gives them grace or decides that person is going to come to him, they will come to him. If you say that unconditional election is true, yet irresistible grace is not, then I believe you say God can fail. Because in that regard, he's chosen you, selected you, has given you grace, and yet you deny him. That means God has not given you enough. He's failed to save you, which I believe is blasphemy, pretty much. My 2 cents on it. But I think in the fact that I want to pull out one verse in John 6, verse 37. It says, all that the Father gives me will come to me, and the one who comes to me I will certainly not cast out. Kind of like we talked about earlier, that the door is open. Jesus is knocking. He's ready to receive you. But if we go with the assumption, like we've talked about in the previous videos, that God is the one who initiates it, by his grace we're saved, and it just happens to be through our faith, but apart from ourselves, then all that the Father gives to the Son, all that the Father decides are going to be saved, will come to Jesus, and he will not cast any of them out.
Yeah, I agree with Gage, and I think that's it with some of these points. Some of these points kind of flow together a little bit. And I think that's kind of what they're meant to do. So obviously, like, it'd be kind of weird for you to, kind of agree with like 3.5 points or something, like that. That just doesn't quite fit. But yeah, again, I can agree with this. I think the regeneration of our evil hearts, I think, is 100% by God's work and none of our own. Like we said, I personally don't even think we have the ability to make that choice. I think, maybe we'll talk a little more about this, kind of already have, but I think that as completely fallen, evil people who don't seek God, I would actually call having the recognition to recognize all that God's done for us and reaching out and accepting that actually as a good work personally, which I just don't think we're capable of. I probably should have brought this up earlier, but whatever. But anyway, just jump back to Irresistible Grace for a minute. But like we said, we don't believe, like, Irresistible Grace, at least I think the better way to determine it, it doesn't mean that people can never resist God's grace. You definitely see that. But again, it has to do, we're just talking Irresistible Grace specifically when it comes to, salvation at that moment. So, but I kind of wrote something here. In addition, when God exercises grace in the soul, he brings about the effect that he tended to bring about. And I believe that's, again, because we were preordained, foredestined. This is the effect he intended to bring about. So when God created us, he brought us into existence. We didn't help him. It was his sovereign work. It's the reason we're here today. So likely, I believe it's his work and his alone that brings us into the state of rebirth and new creation. Hence why it's called irresistible grace. It's grace that works. It's grace that brings about what God wants it to bring about. If indeed we are dead in our sins and trespasses, and if indeed our wills are held captive by the lusts of our flesh, and we need to be liberated from our flesh in order to be saved, then in the final analysis, salvation must be something that God does in us and for us, not something that we do for ourselves in any way. Again, this doesn't mean we can resist God's grace. We do it all the time. But it means his grace is so strong that, as that moment of salvation when God moves in our life, it overcomes our natural resistance to it and brings about a change in our hearts and nature. There's no dragging people kicking and screaming in heaven. If we look at Psalms 110:3, it says, "Your people will volunteer freely in the day of your power, and wholly away from the womb of the dawn. Your youth are to you as to do." So again, there you have people, God, I think part of that salvation, that irresistible grace brings salvation, does bring that recognition, brings us, we realize everything God's done for us in the state we're in, and that, again, will just naturally lead itself to wanting to follow him. I think Paul is the great person to look at this. Look at Paul. He was the leading prosecutor of the church. He was literally the worst choice you almost could have thought of someone for God to pick to essentially be possibly the most influential, writer and apologist in the New Testament. But he does that, and Paul almost says partially that God kind of does that almost to prove a point. But let's look at that. Paul, again, leading enemy of the church, murdering Christians, and he was immediately after that point willing to lay down his life and serve God. And I think that's the best example of what irresistible grace kind of looks like when it comes to salvation.
I encourage you, as you can think about this, return to Romans chapter 8, 29 and 30. I believe it's central, and you can get so much from the book of Romans on theology. And then I believe it's verse 30 there. It talks about those whom he calls, or those whom he called, he justified. And I think that's a pretty definite statement, that if you're called by God, he's, I think, the one who initiates your love for him even, because, once again, we love him because he first loved us. Those whom he calls to himself, those who he, wants to bring closer to himself, will come closer, and God will declare them justified, and you will enter heaven one day. Because, like I mentioned, if it's a work of God, then it will not fail. If it's a work of man, then I think there's a good possibility, if not likelihood, that it's going to fail.